Question 1. Examination of the data shows a shipment of type, a packaged cobalt-60, is being prepared for transport. The RSO is reviewing the documentation and packaging. Which of the following actions best ensures compliance with Department of Transportation regulations regarding the transportation of this radioactive material? Option A. Relying on the licensed carrier to verify that the packaging is appropriate and the shipping papers are complete, as they handle such shipments regularly. Option B. Visually inspecting the exterior of the type, a package for any obvious damage, and ensuring a radioactive materials label is affixed. Option C. Assuming the packaging and documentation are compliant because this specific radioactive source has been shipped in this manner multiple times without any reported issues. Option D. Confirming the shipping papers accurately list the proper shipping name, UN number, hazard class, and transport index, and that the type of packaging is certified and marked according to DOT specifications for radioactive materials. Correct answer is D. Confirming the shipping papers accurately list the proper shipping name, UN number, hazard class, and transport index, and that the type of packaging is certified and marked according to DOT specifications for radioactive materials. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in the transportation of radioactive materials, ensuring compliance with stringent Department of Transportation regulations for packaging, labeling, and shipping papers. The RSO must exercise meticulous judgment to prevent potential safety hazards, environmental contamination, and regulatory penalties. The challenge lies in the interconnectedness of these requirements. A failure in one area can compromise the integrity of the entire shipment. Professional responsibility demands a thorough understanding of the specific DOT hazardous materials regulations, HMR, applicable to radioactive materials. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic verification of all DOT HMR requirements for the specific radioactive material being transported. This includes confirming that the chosen packaging meets the performance standards for the assigned hazard class and quantity, that all required markings and labels, e.g., radioactive YTI, Yellow Roman II or Yellow Roman III labels, UN number, proper shipping name, are correctly applied to the package, and that the shipping papers accurately reflect the material's identity, quantity, hazard class, packaging type, and emergency response information. This comprehensive verification ensures the shipment is safe, secure, and legally compliant, representing best professional practice by prioritizing public safety and regulatory adherence. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that because a shipment has been made previously without incident, the current documentation and packaging are automatically compliant. This overlooks the possibility of changes in regulations, material specifications, or packaging integrity, and represents a failure in due diligence and a disregard for the dynamic nature of regulatory compliance. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on labeling without verifying the underlying packaging integrity or the accuracy of the shipping papers. This is a superficial compliance check that fails to address the fundamental safety requirements of transporting hazardous materials. A third incorrect approach is to rely on the carrier's expertise to ensure compliance without independent verification. While carriers have responsibilities, the shipper, and by extension, the RSO, bears the ultimate responsibility for ensuring the shipment is properly prepared for transport according to DOT regulations. This abdication of responsibility is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a layered decision-making framework. First, identify the specific radioactive material and its associated hazard classification and transport index. Second, consult the relevant sections of the DOT HMR, 49 CFR Parts 100-185, specifically those pertaining to radioactive materials, Part 173, Subpart I. Third, meticulously review the chosen packaging against the regulatory requirements for that material and quantity. Fourth, confirm all required markings and labels are present and accurate. Fifth, scrutinize the shipping papers for completeness and accuracy, cross-referencing with the package and material information. Finally, maintain clear and organized records of all documentation and verification steps. This systematic process ensures all critical elements of DOT compliance are addressed, minimizing risk and upholding professional standards. Question 2. Performance analysis shows that a facility has a radioactive source with a known activity. When communicating potential health risks associated with this source to the public and to regulatory bodies responsible for individual dose monitoring, which radiation unit is most appropriate to describe the potential biological impact on individuals? Option A, Sievert SV. Option B, Gray Jai. Option C, Curie Psi. Option D, Becquerel BQ. The correct answer is A, Sievert SV. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Radiation Safety Officer, RSO, to discern the appropriate radiation unit for communicating risk to different stakeholders, balancing regulatory compliance with effective public communication. The RSO must understand the fundamental differences between units measuring activity, Becquerel, Curie, and those measuring dose, Gray, Rad, Sievert, Rem, as well as the distinction between absorbed dose and dose equivalent. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes clear and accurate communication of radiation risk. By selecting the Sievert SV for dose equivalent, the RSO is using the unit that accounts for the biological effectiveness of different types of radiation, providing a more relevant measure of potential harm to individuals. This aligns with regulatory requirements for dose limitation and reporting, which are typically expressed in terms of dose equivalent. Furthermore, using the Sievert demonstrates an understanding of the regulatory framework's intent to protect human health. An incorrect approach would be to use the Becquerel BQ or Curie Psi when discussing potential health risks to individuals. These units measure the rate of radioactive decay, activity, and do not directly reflect the biological impact of the radiation on tissues. While important for characterizing the source, they are not the primary units for communicating individual dose or risk. Using them in this context would be a regulatory failure as it misrepresents the hazard and fails to comply with dose reporting requirements. Another incorrect approach would be to use the Gray Jai or RAD when discussing potential health effects on individuals without further context. These units measure absorbed dose, which is the energy deposited per unit mass of material. While a crucial measurement, it doesn't fully account for the varying biological effectiveness of different radiation types. For regulatory purposes and effective risk communication regarding human health, dose-equivalent Sievert is generally preferred. Failing to differentiate between absorbed dose and dose equivalent when discussing biological risk constitutes a failure to adhere to the nuanced requirements of radiation protection regulations. The professional reasoning process for the RSO should involve 1. Identifying the audience and purpose of the communication. 2. Recalling the definitions and applications of each radiation unit, activity, absorbed dose, dose equivalent. 3. Consulting the specific regulatory framework to determine which units are mandated for reporting and dose limitation. 4. Selecting the unit that most accurately and effectively conveys the relevant risk information to the intended audience, ensuring compliance and promoting safety. Question 3. Strategic planning requires a robust approach to area monitoring. If a fixed radiation monitor in a controlled area unexpectedly triggers an alarm, what is the most appropriate immediate action for the Radiation Safety Officer, RSO, to take to ensure both safety and operational awareness, adhering to U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission (NRC) guidelines? Option A. Assume the alarm is a malfunction and continue with normal operations while scheduling a monitor check for later in the day. Option B. Initiate an immediate evacuation of the affected area and surrounding zones until the cause of the alarm is fully understood. Option C. Immediately proceed to the location of the alarm with a calibrated portable survey meter to assess the radiation field and verify the alarm. Option D. Rely solely on the fixed monitor's reading and log the event without further immediate investigation, assuming it indicates a significant hazard. The correct answer is C. Immediately proceed to the location of the alarm with a calibrated portable survey meter to assess the radiation field and verify the alarm. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an RSO by requiring them to balance the immediate need for operational continuity with the paramount requirement of ensuring radiation safety. The potential for a false alarm from a fixed monitor, while disruptive, necessitates a thorough and systematic response to avoid complacency and ensure that genuine radiation hazards are not overlooked. The RSO must exercise sound judgment in determining the appropriate level of response without causing undue panic or operational shutdown, while still adhering to regulatory requirements for monitoring and alarm systems. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic investigation of the alarm, starting with verifying the monitor's status, and then conducting a localized survey with a portable instrument. This aligns with regulatory expectations for the proper functioning and response to fixed monitoring systems. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC regulations, specifically 10 CFR Part 20, Subpart K, mandate that licensees establish and maintain a radiation protection program that includes appropriate monitoring and survey equipment. The prompt and thorough investigation of an alarm, followed by a targeted survey, ensures that any potential exposure is identified and mitigated promptly, thereby upholding the ALARA as low as reasonably achievable principle and fulfilling the licensee's responsibility to protect workers and the public. This approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing safety through a structured, evidence-based response. Incorrect approaches analysis. Ignoring the alarm or immediately shutting down operations without investigation represents a failure to comply with regulatory requirements for monitoring and alarm systems. Ignoring the alarm could lead to an unaddressed radiation hazard, violating the licensee's duty to protect individuals and potentially leading to overexposures, which is a direct contravention of 10 CFR Part 20. Immediately shutting down operations without a proper assessment is an overreaction that disrupts workflow unnecessarily and may not be justified by the situation, potentially leading to operational inefficiencies and economic losses without a corresponding safety benefit. Relying solely on the fixed monitor without a portable survey to confirm the reading is also problematic. Fixed monitors can malfunction or provide readings that require independent verification to accurately assess the radiation field and potential dose to individuals. This lack of independent verification could lead to either complacency in the face of a real hazard or unnecessary alarm and disruption. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first consulting their facility's radiation safety procedures, which are developed in accordance with regulatory requirements. The decision-making process should involve 1. Acknowledging and documenting the alarm, 2. Assessing the immediate context of the alarm, e.g., location, time, ongoing operations, 3. Initiating a predefined alarm response protocol, which typically includes verifying the monitor and conducting a portable survey, 4. Evaluating the survey results to determine the nature and extent of any radiation field, and 5. Taking appropriate corrective actions based on the findings, which could range from resetting the monitor to initiating emergency procedures. This systematic approach ensures regulatory compliance, promotes worker safety, and maintains operational awareness. Question 4. Analysis of the operational characteristics of gas-filled detectors, ionization chambers, proportional counters, Geiger-Müller counters, scintillation detectors, and semiconductor detectors is crucial for an RSO to select the most appropriate instrument for a given radiation survey. If an RSO needs to perform a survey to identify specific radionuclides present in a mixed low-level radioactive waste stream and quantify their activity, which detector type would be most suitable and why, considering regulatory requirements for accurate identification and quantification. Option A, an ionization chamber, for its direct measurement of dose rate, which is the primary regulatory concern. Option B, a Geiger-Müller counter, due to its robustness and ability to detect a wide range of radiation types. Option C, a semiconductor detector, such as a high-purity germanium HPGE detector, for its superior energy resolution, enabling precise radionuclide identification and accurate activity quantification. Option D, a scintillation detector, particularly one with a sodium iodide (Na-ITL) crystal, for its efficiency in detecting gamma rays and its ability to provide some energy discrimination. The correct answer is B, a Geiger-Müller counter, due to its robustness and ability to detect a wide range of radiation types. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge for a radiation safety officer, RSO, in selecting the most appropriate radiation detection instrument for a specific task. The challenge lies in understanding the fundamental operating principles of different detector types and matching their characteristics to the radiation field and the desired measurement outcome, while adhering to regulatory requirements for accuracy, sensitivity, and reliability. Professional judgment is required to balance cost, portability, and performance. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the radiation type and energy expected, the required sensitivity and accuracy for the measurement, and the environmental conditions. For instance, if the task involves detecting low-energy beta particles or alpha particles, a Geiger-Müller (GM) counter might be insufficient due to its dead time and inability to distinguish between different radiation types or energies. An ionization chamber, while excellent for dose rate measurements, might lack the sensitivity for detecting very low levels of contamination. A proportional counter offers better energy discrimination than a GM counter and can be used for alpha, beta, and low-energy gamma detection. Semiconductor detectors, with their high efficiency and energy resolution, are often preferred for detailed spectral analysis or precise identification of radionuclides. The RSO must consult relevant regulations, e.g., 10 CFR Part 20 in the U.S. for licensing and dose limits, or equivalent national regulations, to ensure the chosen instrument meets the minimum performance standards for the intended use, such as calibratability and detection limits. An incorrect approach would be to select an instrument based solely on cost or availability, without considering its suitability for the specific radiation field. For example, using a GM counter for precise dose rate measurements in a high radiation field could lead to inaccurate readings due to saturation and dead time effects, potentially violating regulatory dose monitoring requirements. Similarly, using a scintillation detector for alpha particle detection without appropriate shielding or window material would result in no detection, failing to identify a potential hazard, and thus violating the ALARA principle and regulatory requirements for contamination surveys. Relying on an instrument with insufficient sensitivity for the expected contamination levels would lead to a false sense of security and potential overexposure or spread of contamination, which is a direct contravention of radiation protection regulations. Professional decision-making in such situations involves a systematic process. First, clearly define the objective of the measurement, e.g., contamination survey, dose rate assessment, radionuclide identification. Second, characterize the expected radiation field, type, energy, intensity. Third, consult the instrument specifications and compare them against the measurement objectives and regulatory requirements. Fourth, consider practical factors like portability, power source, and ease of use. Finally, ensure the instrument is properly calibrated and maintained according to regulatory standards. Question 5. Governance review demonstrates potential inconsistencies in the documented calibration procedures for portable radiation survey meters used across multiple departments. The review specifically notes a lack of documented source checks performed at the required frequency and a discrepancy in background measurement protocols between different teams. As the radiation safety officer, what is the most appropriate course of action to address these findings and ensure ongoing regulatory compliance and operational effectiveness? Option A. Instruct each department to independently review and update their own calibration and background measurement procedures based on their perceived needs, without a centralized oversight or standardization. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive review of all existing calibration records, source check logs, and background measurement protocols. Develop and implement a standardized, site-wide procedure for instrument calibration, source checks, and background measurements, ensuring it aligns with regulatory requirements and provides for adequate staff training on the updated protocols. Option C. Rely on the manufacturer's recommended calibration and maintenance schedules for all instruments, assuming these are sufficient to meet all regulatory obligations. Option D. Immediately order the replacement of all portable radiation survey meters that are approaching their scheduled calibration dates, assuming that the inconsistencies are due to aging equipment. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive review of all existing calibration records, source check logs, and background measurement protocols. Develop and implement a standardized, site-wide procedure for instrument calibration, source checks, and background measurements, ensuring it aligns with regulatory requirements and provides for adequate staff training on the updated protocols. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for radiation safety officers, RSO, where a routine governance review highlights potential deficiencies in instrument calibration and quality control. The challenge lies in interpreting the findings, determining the root cause of any identified issues, and implementing corrective actions that are both compliant with regulatory requirements and effective in ensuring the accuracy and reliability of radiation detection equipment. The RSO must balance immediate operational needs with long-term safety and compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, evidence-based evaluation of the governance review findings. This means thoroughly investigating the specific instruments flagged, reviewing calibration records, assessing the frequency and adequacy of source checks and background measurements, and examining the maintenance logs. The RSO must then consult the relevant regulatory framework, e.g., 10 CFR Part 20, UREG 1556 Vol. 1, or equivalent for the specified jurisdiction, to ensure all procedures meet or exceed established standards for accuracy, reliability, and traceability. Implementing a corrective action plan that addresses the identified gaps, including retraining staff if necessary and updating written procedures, represents best professional practice. This proactive and thorough approach ensures continued compliance, minimizes the risk of inaccurate dose assessments, and upholds the ethical responsibility to protect individuals and the environment from unnecessary radiation exposure. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the findings as minor or a clerical oversight without proper investigation. This fails to acknowledge the potential for equipment malfunction or procedural drift, which could lead to inaccurate radiation measurements. Ethically, this demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the importance of reliable instrumentation in radiation safety. Regulatorily, it could be a violation of requirements for maintaining calibrated and operable equipment. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately replace all instruments without a thorough assessment of the existing ones. While seemingly decisive, this is often an inefficient and costly solution. It fails to identify the specific cause of any potential issues, which might be procedural rather than equipment-related. This approach could also lead to the disposal of perfectly functional equipment, which is not a sustainable or responsible use of resources. It bypasses the critical step of root cause analysis mandated by good quality assurance practices. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on manufacturer recommendations for calibration and maintenance, without cross-referencing them with specific regulatory requirements or site-specific operational needs. While manufacturers provide valuable guidance, regulatory bodies often have more stringent or specific requirements for certain types of instruments or applications. Ignoring these specific regulatory mandates can lead to non-compliance and potentially inadequate safety margins. Professional reasoning. When faced with such a governance review finding, a professional RSO should adopt a structured problem-solving approach. First, understand the scope and specifics of the review's findings. Second, gather all relevant data, including calibration certificates, maintenance logs, and operational procedures. Third, compare these findings against the applicable regulatory requirements and established best practices. Fourth, conduct a root cause analysis for any identified discrepancies. Fifth, develop and implement a targeted corrective action plan. Finally, document all actions taken and verify their effectiveness through follow-up audits or checks. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and effectively address the underlying issues. Question 6. The assessment process reveals that a radiation worker who has consistently received doses below the annual regulatory limit throughout their career is experiencing anxiety regarding the potential long-term health consequences of their cumulative occupational radiation exposure, specifically concerning the development of cancer. As the Radiation Safety Officer, RSO, which of the following approaches best addresses this situation while adhering to regulatory frameworks and best practices for radiation safety? Option A. Advise the worker to seek medical attention for their anxiety, as radiation doses below the regulatory limit are scientifically proven to have no long-term health effects, including cancer. Option B. Acknowledge the worker's concerns. Explain the probabilistic nature of radiation-induced cancer and the concept of latency periods, and review the facility's ALARA program to ensure all exposures are maintained as low as reasonably achievable, even below regulatory limits. Option C. Inform the worker that since their doses are below the annual limit, no further action or discussion regarding potential long-term health risks is necessary, as the regulatory framework is designed to fully protect them. Option D. Reassure the worker that their cumulative dose is well within established regulatory limits, and therefore, the risk of radiation-induced cancer is negligible and not a cause for concern. The correct answer is D. Reassure the worker that their cumulative dose is well within established regulatory limits, and therefore, the risk of radiation-induced cancer is negligible and not a cause for concern. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent uncertainties in radiation-induced carcinogenesis, particularly when dealing with low-dose exposures and the long latency periods involved. The RSO must balance the need for robust radiation protection with the practicalities of operational safety and the psychological impact on individuals. The absence of immediate observable effects from radiation exposure necessitates a proactive and risk-informed approach, relying on established scientific principles and regulatory guidance rather than direct evidence of harm at the time of exposure. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that considers the potential for stochastic effects, specifically cancer, even at doses below established limits. This aligns with the ALARA as low as reasonably achievable principle, which is a cornerstone of radiation protection philosophy and is mandated by regulatory frameworks. By focusing on the latency period and the probabilistic nature of radiation-induced cancer, the RSO demonstrates an understanding of the long-term health implications and the importance of minimizing cumulative dose. This approach prioritizes the health and safety of individuals by implementing protective measures that reduce the likelihood of future adverse health outcomes, thereby upholding ethical obligations and regulatory requirements for radiation safety. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the concern solely because the individual's dose is below the established annual dose limit. This fails to acknowledge that dose limits are primarily designed to prevent deterministic effects and to keep the probability of stochastic effects, like cancer, at an acceptably low level, not to eliminate the risk entirely. Radiation-induced cancer is a stochastic effect, meaning its probability, not its severity, is proportional to dose. Therefore, even doses below the limit carry a non-zero risk, and the ALARA principle requires minimizing this risk. Another incorrect approach would be to focus only on immediate health effects or the absence of acute radiation syndrome. This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of radiation carcinogenesis, which is characterized by long latency periods, often decades, and is a probabilistic outcome. Ignoring potential long-term effects due to the lack of immediate symptoms is a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it neglects the core purpose of radiation protection for stochastic risks. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on anecdotal evidence or the absence of reported cancer cases in the facility's history. While historical data can be informative, it does not negate the scientific understanding of radiation's carcinogenic potential. Each exposure must be evaluated based on established risk models and regulatory guidance, not solely on past observations, which may not be statistically significant or representative of all potential exposure scenarios. This approach is a failure to adhere to a scientifically grounded and regulatory-mandated risk assessment process. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based decision-making framework that integrates regulatory requirements, scientific understanding of radiation biology, and ethical considerations. This involves 1. Identifying potential hazards and exposure scenarios. 2. Quantifying or estimating doses received. 3. Evaluating the associated risks, particularly stochastic risks like cancer, considering latency periods and dose-response relationships. 4. Implementing protective measures in accordance with the ALARA principle and established dose limits. 5. Communicating risks transparently and providing appropriate follow-up. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and prioritize the long-term well-being of individuals and the public. Question 7. Benchmark analysis indicates that a facility is planning to implement a new research protocol involving low-dose, high-energy particle irradiation of cell cultures. As the Radiation Safety Officer, RSO, which approach best integrates the understanding of cellular radiobiology to ensure effective radiation protection and regulatory compliance for this new research. Option A. Prioritize minimizing direct ionization events within the cell nucleus, as this is the primary mechanism for DNA damage, and consider indirect effects as secondary. Option B. Implement protection measures based on general radiation physics principles without specific consideration for the biological response of the cells, such as DNA repair capacity or the presence of oxygen. Option C. Develop a comprehensive protection strategy that accounts for both direct and indirect cellular effects, acknowledges the varying radiosensitivity across the cell cycle, and uses cell survival curve data to inform risk assessment and protective measures. Option D. Focus solely on ensuring the total delivered dose remains below established regulatory limits, assuming that any dose within these limits is inherently safe for all cell types and phases. The correct answer is D. Focus solely on ensuring the total delivered dose remains below established regulatory limits, assuming that any dose within these limits is inherently safe for all cell types and phases. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an RSO by requiring them to interpret and apply complex cellular radiobiology principles to a practical radiation safety program implementation. The challenge lies in translating theoretical knowledge of direct and indirect cellular effects, DNA damage mechanisms, cell survival curves, and cell cycle influences into actionable safety protocols that are both effective in minimizing biological harm and compliant with regulatory requirements. The RSO must make informed decisions about the level of protection needed based on the potential for different types of radiation-induced cellular damage, considering that the biological impact is not solely dependent on dose, but also on the biological system's response, which is influenced by the cell cycle phase. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of how radiation interacts with biological matter at the cellular level, and how this knowledge informs risk assessment and control measures. This includes recognizing that indirect effects, mediated by free radicals, are significant, especially in the presence of oxygen, and that direct ionization of critical molecules like DNA is also a primary mechanism of damage. Understanding cell survival curves allows for the prediction of cellular response to varying doses and dose rates, highlighting the importance of minimizing dose to reduce the probability of cell death or mutation. Crucially, acknowledging the cell cycle's influence on radiosensitivity means that protective measures should consider the proliferative state of cells, as some phases are more vulnerable than others. This integrated understanding allows the RSO to implement a robust radiation protection program that is scientifically sound, ethically responsible, and regulatory compliant by focusing on ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, principles informed by the biological consequences of radiation exposure. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on dose limits without considering the underlying cellular mechanisms. This fails to acknowledge that biological effects are not linear with dose, and that factors like dose rate and cellular repair mechanisms play a role. It also overlooks the importance of understanding DNA damage types and their repair, which can lead to mutations and long-term health effects. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the cell cycle's impact on radiosensitivity. This would lead to a one-size-fits-all protection strategy that might be overly stringent or insufficiently protective, depending on the specific tissues or cell types being considered. Ethically, this is a failure to optimize protection based on available scientific knowledge. A further incorrect approach would be to prioritize only direct ionization effects and neglect the significant contribution of indirect, free radical-mediated damage, especially in aerobic environments. This incomplete understanding of radiation-tissue interaction would lead to an inadequate assessment of risk and potentially insufficient protective measures. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such challenges by first grounding their understanding in the fundamental principles of radiobiology as mandated by regulatory frameworks. This involves continuous learning and staying abreast of scientific advancements. When implementing safety protocol, the RSO must perform a comprehensive risk assessment that integrates dose considerations with biological endpoints, including DNA damage and cell cycle effects. The ALARA principle should guide all decisions, ensuring that protective measures are not only compliant, but also demonstrably effective in minimizing biological harm. Ethical considerations demand that the RSO act in the best interest of the exposed individuals and the public, which requires a deep, nuanced understanding of the science underpinning radiation protection. Question 8. Benchmark analysis indicates that in a typical industrial setting, the primary contributors to occupational radiation exposure are often a combination of naturally occurring and artificially introduced radioactive materials. Considering the distinct pathways of internal and external exposure, Which of the following approaches best reflects a comprehensive initial assessment of potential radiation sources for an RSO? Option A, focusing exclusively on artificial sources, as these are the primary concern for regulatory compliance and occupational health in industrial environments. Option B, attributing all significant occupational exposure solely to natural sources, such as radon and background gamma radiation, as these are ubiquitous. Option C, prioritizing the assessment of artificial sources introduced by industrial processes, while acknowledging that natural sources like cosmic and terrestrial radiation contribute to external exposure and naturally occurring radioactive materials can lead to internal exposure. Option D, concentrating solely on external exposure pathways, assuming that internal exposure from both natural and artificial sources is negligible in most industrial settings. The correct answer is C, prioritizing the assessment of artificial sources introduced by industrial processes, while acknowledging that natural sources like cosmic and terrestrial radiation contribute to external exposure and naturally occurring radioactive materials can lead to internal exposure. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an RSO by requiring them to differentiate between the primary sources of radiation exposure in a typical workplace setting, specifically focusing on the distinction between natural and artificial sources and their contribution to both internal and external exposure. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the relative significance of these sources to inform effective radiation protection strategies, which is crucial for compliance and worker safety. Misidentification or underestimation of any source can lead to inadequate shielding, improper monitoring, or ineffective dose reduction measures. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive understanding of the radiation environment, recognizing that both natural and artificial sources contribute to occupational exposure. It correctly identifies cosmic and terrestrial radiation as primary natural sources, contributing to external exposure. It also acknowledges that internal exposure arises from the inhalation or ingestion of radioactive materials, which can be either naturally occurring, e.g., radon, or artificially introduced. A robust RSO's assessment would prioritize identifying and quantifying these contributions to establish a baseline, and then evaluate the impact of any artificial sources introduced by the facility's operations. This aligns with the fundamental principles of radiation protection, which mandate minimizing exposure from all sources, with a particular focus on controllable artificial sources. Incorrect approaches analysis. Focusing solely on artificial sources ignores the significant background radiation from natural sources, which can be substantial and contribute to the total effective dose equivalent. This failure to account for natural background radiation can lead to an incomplete risk assessment and potentially underestimation of overall exposure. Conversely, attributing all exposure solely to natural sources would lead to an overemphasis on background radiation and a neglect of potentially higher-risk artificial sources, which are often the focus of regulatory oversight and require specific control measures. Ignoring internal exposure entirely is a critical failure, as it represents a significant pathway for dose accumulation, particularly from inhaled or ingested radionuclides, and requires distinct monitoring and control strategies separate from external exposure. Overlooking the distinction between internal and external exposure pathways means that protective measures might be misapplied, such as focusing solely on shielding for internal emitters or ventilation for external sources. Professional reasoning. A professional RSO should approach this by first establishing the baseline radiation levels from natural sources, cosmic and terrestrial, using appropriate survey equipment and reference data. Subsequently, they must identify all artificial sources present in the workplace, assess their operational characteristics, and quantify their potential contribution to external and internal exposure. This involves understanding the type of radionuclides, their activity, the geometry of the source, and the duration and proximity of worker exposure. The RSO must then integrate these assessments to determine the total occupational dose and implement appropriate control measures, including engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment, in accordance with regulatory requirements. This systematic approach ensures that all significant exposure pathways are addressed and that protective measures are proportionate to the risk. Question 9. System analysis indicates that a facility is storing several sealed sources of different radioactive isotopes. The RSO is tasked with assessing the long-term radiological risk associated with these sources, considering their inherent decay properties. Which of the following conceptual understandings best informs this risk assessment without requiring specific numerical calculations? Option A. Source with a shorter half-life will have a higher decay constant, and thus its activity will decrease more rapidly over time, leading to a reduced long-term radiological hazard compared to a source with a longer half-life, assuming similar initial activities. Option B. The initial measured activity of a radioactive source is the only factor that determines its long-term radiological risk, as the decay process does not significantly alter the hazard over extended periods. Option C. The type of radiation emitted, alpha, beta, or gamma, is the sole determinant of the long-term radiological hazard, irrespective of the decay rate. Option D. All radioactive isotopes decay at a uniform rate, meaning their activity decreases linearly over time. The correct answer is A. A source with a shorter half-life will have a higher decay constant, and thus its activity will decrease more rapidly over time, leading to a reduced long-term radiological hazard compared to a source with a longer half-life, assuming similar initial activities. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an RSO by requiring them to interpret and apply fundamental principles of radioactive decay in the context of potential safety concern, without resorting to direct calculation. The challenge lies in understanding the implications of half-life and activity on the long-term management and potential hazards of radioactive materials, necessitating a conceptual grasp of decay processes rather than mere numerical manipulation. The RSO must consider how the inherent nature of radioactive decay influences the risk profile over time and inform appropriate safety protocols. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by focusing on the conceptual understanding of radioactive decay and its implications for risk assessment. It correctly identifies that a shorter half-life leads to a more rapid decrease in activity, thus reducing the long-term radiological hazard. This aligns with regulatory principles that mandate risk assessment and management based on the properties of the radioactive material. By understanding that activity is directly proportional to the number of radioactive atoms and the decay constant, which is inversely related to half-life, the RSO can conceptually grasp how decay impacts the radiation field and potential exposure over time. This conceptual understanding is crucial for making informed decisions about shielding, containment, waste disposal, and emergency preparedness, all of which are core RSO responsibilities under regulatory frameworks. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach might focus solely on the initial measured activity without considering the decay rate. This fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of radioactive materials and the fundamental principle of half-life. Ethically and regulatorily, this is a failure because it leads to an incomplete risk assessment, potentially underestimating or overestimating the long-term hazard, and thus failing to implement appropriate safety measures for the evolving radiological environment. Another incorrect approach could be to assume that all radioactive materials decay at the same rate, regardless of their specific isotope. This ignores the fundamental concept of different isotopes having distinct half-lives, which is a cornerstone of radiation safety. This approach would lead to misclassification of hazards and inappropriate safety protocols, violating regulatory requirements for material-specific risk assessment. A third incorrect approach might be to focus only on the type of decay, alpha, beta, gamma, without considering the half-life or activity. While understanding decay types is important for determining shielding and internal vs. external hazard, it is insufficient for a comprehensive risk assessment. The rate at which these decays occur, dictated by half-life and activity, is critical for determining the magnitude and duration of the hazard. This approach would be regulatorily deficient as it omits key parameters for effective risk management. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the core radioactive properties relevant to safety, the isotope, its half-life, and its current activity. They should then conceptually link these properties to potential hazards, considering how decay will alter the radiation field and the material's overall risk profile over time. This involves understanding the inverse relationship between half-life and decay rate, and the direct relationship between activity and the number of decay events. The RSO's decision-making process should be guided by the principle of ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, and the specific requirements of the governing regulatory body, ensuring that all safety measures are commensurate with the assessed risk, which is inherently influenced by radioactive decay characteristics. Question 10. Which approach would be most appropriate for a radiation safety officer to ensure the protection of personnel from both acute and chronic radiation exposures, considering the dose-response relationships for stochastic and deterministic effects? Option A. Implementing robust monitoring and control measures to keep all occupational exposures as low as reasonably achievable ALARA, well below regulatory dose limits, and conducting regular reviews of potential exposure scenarios. Option B. Relying on the absence of immediate observable symptoms in personnel as confirmation that radiation protection measures are adequate. Option C. Focusing exclusively on preventing deterministic effects by ensuring doses remain below established thresholds for such effects, without significant emphasis on stochastic risk minimization. Option D. Dismissing the significance of low-dose exposures due to the statistically low probability of immediate adverse health outcomes. The correct answer is A. Implementing robust monitoring and control measures to keep all occupational exposures as low as reasonably achievable, ALARA, well below regulatory dose limits, and conducting regular reviews of potential exposure scenarios. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the radiation safety officer, RSO, to interpret and apply complex biological effects of radiation in a practical, risk management context, without the benefit of direct measurement or immediate observable outcomes. The RSO must balance the need for protective measures with the operational realities of a facility, ensuring compliance with regulatory dose limits while minimizing potential harm to individuals. The challenge lies in the probabilistic nature of stochastic effects and the delayed onset of both stochastic and deterministic effects, necessitating a proactive and informed approach to radiation protection. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the fundamental principles of radiation protection as mandated by regulatory frameworks, such as those found in the United States, e.g., 10 CFR Part 20. This approach prioritizes minimizing dose to individuals, particularly to the point where the risk of stochastic effects becomes negligible and deterministic effects are avoided. It involves a thorough understanding of dose-response relationships, recognizing that even low doses carry a non-zero risk of stochastic effects, and that deterministic effects have a threshold dose. By focusing on ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, principles and implementing robust monitoring and control measures, the RSO ensures that exposures are kept well below established regulatory limits, thereby upholding ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. This proactive stance is crucial for preventing long-term health consequences and maintaining public trust. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on avoiding deterministic effects by ensuring doses remain below known thresholds fails to adequately address the probabilistic nature of stochastic effects. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it ignores the potential for radiation-induced cancer or genetic effects, which can occur at doses below the threshold for deterministic effects. Such an approach would be non-compliant with regulations that aim to minimize all radiation risks, not just those that are immediately observable or severe. Another incorrect approach that relies on the absence of immediate symptoms as an indicator of safety is also a significant failure. This overlooks the latency period associated with many radiation-induced health effects, both deterministic and stochastic. It is both a regulatory failure, as it does not account for potential long-term consequences, and an ethical failure, as it prioritizes short-term convenience over the long-term well-being of individuals. A third incorrect approach that dismisses the significance of low-dose exposures due to the perceived low probability of harm is also professionally unacceptable. While the probability of harm at very low doses is indeed low, the cumulative effect of repeated low-dose exposures, or the possibility of a single higher-than-expected exposure, necessitates a cautious and protective stance. Regulatory frameworks are built on the premise that all radiation exposure carries some risk, and the goal is to manage and minimize that risk. Ignoring this principle is a direct contravention of the precautionary principle inherent in radiation safety regulations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a comprehensive risk assessment that considers the potential for both deterministic and stochastic effects. This includes understanding the specific radiation sources, the potential exposure pathways, the dose rates, and the duration of exposure. The RSO must then apply the principles of radiation protection, including justification of procedures, optimization of protection, ALARA, and dose limitation. Regular review of monitoring data, incident reports, and advancements in radiobiology is essential to adapt and refine protective strategies. Furthermore, clear communication with personnel regarding potential risks and protective measures is paramount. Question 11. The review process indicates a proposal for a new imaging technique that promises to reduce patient scan times by 20%, but preliminary assessments suggest a potential increase in scatter radiation to the technologist during certain phases of the procedure. As the Radiation Safety Officer, RSO, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with the ALARA principle? Option A. Approve the new imaging technique immediately due to its significant efficiency gains, with a general instruction to technologists to maintain safe working distances. Option B. Implement the new imaging technique and rely on existing radiation safety training to ensure technologists manage their exposures appropriately. Option C. Conduct a detailed ALARA review of the proposed technique, actively seeking methods to minimize technologist exposure through engineering controls, optimized positioning and appropriate shielding, and document these findings and implemented controls. Option D. Reject the new imaging technique outright, as any potential increase in radiation exposure is unacceptable. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed ALARA review of the proposed technique, actively seeking methods to minimize technologist exposure through engineering controls, optimized positioning, and appropriate shielding, and document these findings and implemented controls. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for radiation safety officers, RSO, where a new procedure is proposed that could increase efficiency but also potentially increase radiation exposure. The core of the challenge lies in balancing operational needs with the fundamental regulatory requirement to keep radiation doses as low as reasonably achievable. ALARA. The RSO must critically evaluate the proposed changes, not just for their immediate benefits, but for their long-term implications on radiation safety culture and compliance. This requires a deep understanding of the ALARA principle and its practical implementation beyond mere compliance with dose limits. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough ALARA review that actively seeks to identify and implement methods to reduce potential exposures associated with the new procedure. This aligns directly with the regulatory framework's emphasis on proactive dose reduction. It requires the RSO to engage with the proposing department, explore alternative techniques, consider engineering controls, administrative procedures, and personal protective equipment, and document the rationale for the chosen methods. This demonstrates a commitment to the ALARA principle as a continuous improvement process, not just a reactive measure. Ethically, it upholds the professional responsibility to protect individuals from unnecessary radiation. Incorrect approaches analysis. Approving the procedure solely based on the projected time savings without a robust ALARA assessment fails to meet the regulatory requirement for optimization. This approach prioritizes operational efficiency over radiation safety, which is a direct violation of the ALARA principle. It suggests a lack of diligence in the RSO's duties and a potential disregard for the well-being of personnel. Implementing the procedure with a general statement that staff will be trained to be careful is insufficient. This is a vague and unquantifiable approach that lacks specific measures for dose reduction. It places the burden of ALARA solely on individual awareness without providing the necessary tools, controls, or oversight. This is a regulatory failure as it does not demonstrate a systematic program for dose optimization. Rejecting the procedure outright without exploring potential ALARA measures is also an incorrect approach. While caution is necessary, complete rejection without considering if the procedure could be modified or implemented with effective ALARA controls stifles innovation and operational improvement. It may not be reasonably achievable to eliminate all exposure, but the regulatory requirement is to reduce it to the lowest practicable level. This approach fails to demonstrate a willingness to find a balance. Professional reasoning. When faced with a proposal that may impact radiation exposure, the RSO should follow a structured decision-making process. First, understand the proposed procedure and its intended benefits. Second, conduct a comprehensive ALARA assessment, identifying potential exposure pathways and estimating potential doses. Third, brainstorm and evaluate various ALARA strategies, including engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment. Fourth, consult with the proposing department and other relevant stakeholders to discuss findings and potential solutions. Fifth, document the ALARA review, the chosen controls, and the rationale for their selection. Finally, implement the procedure with the agreed-upon ALARA measures and establish a system for ongoing monitoring and review. This systematic approach ensures regulatory compliance, promotes a strong safety culture, and protects individuals from unnecessary radiation exposure. Question 12. The analysis reveals that a research team plans to use a new radioisotope with a poorly characterized emission spectrum for an extended experimental run. The team is eager to begin immediately, and the proposed shielding consists of standard lead bricks, a material commonly used in the lab. As the radiation safety officer, you are tasked with approving the shielding plan. Which of the following actions best upholds your professional and regulatory responsibilities? Option A. Approve the use of standard lead bricks, assuming they will provide adequate shielding as they have for other radioisotopes in the past, and instruct the team to monitor radiation levels closely. Option B. Conduct a detailed analysis of the radioisotope's energy spectrum and the dominant radiation-matter interaction mechanisms, photoelectric effect, Compton scattering, pair production, at those energies to determine the most effective shielding material and thickness, referencing specific attenuation coefficients. Option C. Advise the research team to proceed with their experiment using the lead bricks and to submit a formal shielding request for review after they have gathered preliminary data. Option D. Recommend the use of a thicker layer of lead bricks than typically used, based on a general understanding of lead's shielding properties, without a specific analysis of the isotope's interactions. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed analysis of the radioisotope's energy spectrum and the dominant radiation-matter interaction mechanisms, photoelectric effect, Compton scattering, pair production, at those energies to determine the most effective shielding material and thickness, referencing specific attenuation coefficients. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between immediate operational needs and the long-term safety and regulatory compliance requirements. The RSO must balance the urgency of a research project with the need for thorough understanding and adherence to radiation interaction principles, which directly inform shielding design and dose assessment. Careful judgment is required to ensure that decisions are not solely driven by expediency, but are grounded in sound scientific principles and regulatory mandates. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of radiation-matter interactions before finalizing operational procedures and shielding. This aligns with the fundamental principles of radiation safety, which emphasize minimizing dose through effective shielding and control measures. Specifically, understanding the dominant interaction mechanisms, photoelectric effect, Compton scattering, pair production, at the energy levels of the isotopes used is crucial for selecting appropriate shielding materials and thicknesses. The linear and mass attenuation coefficients are direct quantitative measures derived from these interactions, essential for accurate dose rate calculations, and ensuring compliance with dose limits set by the relevant regulatory body, e.g., NRC in the U.S. This proactive, knowledge-based approach ensures that safety is integrated into the design and operation from the outset, fulfilling the RSO's ethical and regulatory duty to protect workers and the public. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on readily available shielding materials without considering the specific interaction mechanisms and energy spectrum of the radiation would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of deep understanding of radiation physics, leading to potentially inadequate shielding. Such an approach could result in exceeding regulatory dose limits, a direct violation of established safety standards, and potentially leading to enforcement actions. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of the RSO's duty to ensure a safe working environment. Another incorrect approach that relies on historical shielding practices for similar isotopes without re-evaluating the specific experimental setup and energy spectrum would also be professionally unsound. While historical data can be a useful starting point, radiation interactions are energy dependent. Changes in the experimental setup or the specific isotopic form could alter the radiation spectrum, rendering previous assumptions invalid. This could lead to undershielding or overshielding, both of which are inefficient and potentially unsafe. The regulatory failure lies in not performing a current, site-specific risk assessment based on the actual radiation sources and conditions. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of project initiation over thorough safety assessment, assuming that standard laboratory shielding will suffice, is ethically and regulatorily flawed. This approach neglects the RSO's responsibility to actively identify and mitigate radiation hazards. It assumes a level of safety that has not been scientifically verified for the specific circumstances, potentially exposing personnel to unnecessary radiation doses. Ethical failure is the prioritization of research progress over worker safety, and the regulatory failure is the omission of a critical safety review and design process mandated by radiation safety regulations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify the radiation sources and their energy spectra. 2. Understand the dominant radiation-matter interaction mechanisms for those energies. 3. Determine the relevant linear and mass attenuation coefficients for potential shielding materials. 4. Calculate required shielding thicknesses based on dose rate limits and operational parameters. 5. Consult relevant regulatory requirements and guidelines for specific shielding and operational protocols. 6. Document all assessments, calculations, and decisions thoroughly. 7. Communicate findings and recommendations clearly to all stakeholders. Question 13. The risk matrix shows a low probability of a heritable genetic effect occurring from routine radiation exposure in a medical facility, but a high potential severity if it were to occur. As the radiation safety officer, what is the most appropriate course of action to manage this identified risk? Option A. Rely solely on the established regulatory dose limits for occupational exposure, assuming that compliance with these limits inherently protects against any significant risk of heritable genetic effects. Option B. Mandate a complete cessation of all procedures involving ionizing radiation until further research can definitively eliminate any risk of heritable genetic effects, regardless of the medical necessity. Option C. Acknowledge the low probability of occurrence and focus resources on managing higher probability, lower severity risks, as the potential for heritable genetic effects is statistically insignificant in routine practice. Option D. Implement enhanced shielding and strict access controls for all areas where radiation is used, ensuring all personnel, particularly those of reproductive age, are monitored, and their cumulative doses are kept well below regulatory dose limits, reinforcing the ALARA principle. The correct answer is D. Implement enhanced shielding and strict access controls for all areas where radiation is used, ensuring all personnel, particularly those of reproductive age, are monitored, and their cumulative doses are kept well below regulatory dose limits, reinforcing the ALARA principle. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a low probability of a heritable genetic effect occurring from routine radiation exposure in a medical facility, but a high potential severity if it were to occur. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the radiation safety officer, RSO, to balance the practical realities of radiation use with the theoretical, albeit low probability, severe consequences of genetic damage. The RSO must interpret the risk matrix in the context of established dose limits and the ALARA principle, ensuring that while the probability is low, the potential severity is adequately addressed through robust safety protocols. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the fundamental principles of radiation protection, specifically the ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable principle, and the regulatory framework governing dose limits. By focusing on minimizing exposure to all individuals, especially those of reproductive capacity, and ensuring that all exposures are justified and kept below established dose limits, the RSO is proactively mitigating the potential for any genetic effects, regardless of their low assessed probability. This approach prioritizes the long-term health and genetic integrity of the population, which is a core ethical and regulatory responsibility. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the low probability of occurrence, disregarding the high severity, would be a regulatory and ethical failure. It would imply a complacency that is not permissible under radiation safety regulations, which mandate a precautionary approach. Such an approach would neglect the potential for cumulative effects or unforeseen circumstances, failing to uphold the ALARA principle. Another incorrect approach that might involve implementing overly burdensome and impractical controls that significantly impede necessary medical procedures would also be a failure. While aiming for safety, this would violate the principle of justification, as the benefits of the medical procedure might be outweighed by the excessive radiation protection measures. It would also be an inefficient use of resources and could negatively impact patient care. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic evaluation. 1. Understand the regulatory framework. Identify all applicable dose limits and safety principles, e.g., ALARA. Justification optimization. 2. Assess the risk. Interpret the risk matrix considering both probability and severity. 3. Evaluate existing controls. Determine if current safety measures are adequate to keep exposures ALARA and below dose limits. 4. Justify exposures. Ensure all radiation uses are medically justified. 5. Optimize protection. Implement or enhance controls to further reduce doses where feasible without compromising medical necessity. 6. Communicate and train. Ensure all personnel understand the risks and their responsibilities. Question 14. The monitoring system demonstrates a sustained, low-level increase in ambient dose rates in a specific laboratory area, exceeding the established action level by approximately 15%. This increase is not accompanied by any audible alarms or alerts from personnel dosimeters. As the radiation safety officer, what is the most appropriate initial course of action? Option A. Assume the readings are due to background radiation fluctuations and continue with routine operations. Option B. Instruct all personnel in the affected area to cease work and undergo immediate bioassay testing. Option C. Conduct a thorough check of the monitoring equipment's calibration and functionality, and cross-reference readings with other available survey instruments and personnel dosimetry data. Option D. Immediately evacuate the area and initiate a full site-wide alert. The correct answer is D. Immediately evacuate the area and initiate a full site-wide alert. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves interpreting real-time radiation monitoring data that deviates from expected baseline levels, potentially indicating an exposure event. The RSO must quickly assess the significance of the deviation, determine the cause, and implement appropriate protective actions without causing undue alarm or compromising safety protocols. The challenge lies in balancing the need for immediate response with the requirement for accurate assessment and adherence to established procedures. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic investigation that begins with verifying the monitoring equipment's functionality and cross-referencing data with other available information, such as personnel dosimetry records and area surveys. This aligns with regulatory requirements, e.g., 10 CFR Part 20 in the U.S., that mandate prompt assessment of potential exposures and the maintenance of accurate records. By initiating a thorough investigation, the RSO ensures that any actual exposure is identified, quantified, and managed according to established dose limits and reporting requirements, thereby upholding the ALARA principle and protecting worker health. This methodical approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing data integrity and a comprehensive understanding of the situation before taking action. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately assume a significant exposure and initiate a full-scale evacuation and lockdown without further investigation. This fails to consider potential equipment malfunction or transient environmental factors, leading to unnecessary disruption, potential economic loss, and erosion of trust in safety procedures. Ethically, it violates the principle of proportionality by overreacting to unconfirmed data. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the elevated readings as insignificant without any verification, attributing them to background fluctuations or equipment noise. This is a critical regulatory failure, as it neglects the duty to investigate any indication of potential radiation exposure, as required by regulations. It also represents an ethical failure to protect workers by potentially allowing an uncontrolled exposure to continue. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the automated alarm system without independent verification or contextual analysis. While alarms are important triggers, they are not infallible. Over-reliance on automated systems without human oversight can lead to misinterpretations and inappropriate responses, failing to meet the professional standard of due diligence in radiation safety management. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by following a tiered investigative process. First, verify the data and equipment. Second, gather contextual information. Third, assess the potential risk based on established protocols and dose limits. And finally, implement appropriate actions, which may range from further monitoring to personnel notification and medical evaluation, always documenting each step. Question 15. During the evaluation of new portable radiation survey meters for a facility that handles a variety of radioisotopes with differing energy spectra, which detector characteristic is most critical to ensure accurate and reliable dose rate measurements across the entire range of expected radiation fields? Option A. The detector's energy dependence and its ability to provide a relatively flat response across the expected energy spectrum. Option B. The detector's energy resolution, allowing for precise identification of specific radionuclides. Option C. The detector's overall counting efficiency, regardless of the energy of the incident radiation. Option D. The detector's time response, ensuring it can register rapid changes in radiation levels. The correct answer is A. The detector's energy dependence and its ability to provide a relatively flat response across the expected energy spectrum. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because the RSO must select a detector that balances multiple performance characteristics against the specific requirements of the radiation monitoring task. Simply choosing the detector with the highest efficiency might lead to an unacceptable response time or poor energy resolution, compromising the ability to accurately identify and quantify radiation sources. Conversely, prioritizing resolution above all else could result in a detector that is too slow to be practical for routine surveys. The RSO's judgment is critical in understanding the trade-offs and aligning detector capabilities with the operational context and regulatory expectations for radiation protection. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a comprehensive understanding of detector physics and their practical implications in a radiation safety program. By considering efficiency, resolution, response time, and energy dependence in relation to the specific radionuclides and radiation fields likely to be encountered, the RSO ensures the chosen detector will provide accurate, timely, and relevant information for radiation protection decisions. This aligns with regulatory requirements, e.g., 10 CFR Part 20 in the U.S., which mandates appropriate monitoring and dose assessment, by ensuring the tools used are fit for purpose and contribute to maintaining radiation exposures as low as reasonably achievable, ALARA. Ethical considerations are also met by prioritizing the safety of individuals through reliable monitoring. An incorrect approach that prioritizes only detector efficiency without considering other factors fails to meet regulatory requirements for accurate radiation assessment. High efficiency is meaningless if the detector cannot distinguish between different radiation types or energies, poor resolution, or if its response is too slow to detect transient or rapidly changing radiation fields. This could lead to underestimation of dose or misidentification of hazards, violating the ALARA principle and potentially exposing individuals to unnecessary radiation. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on energy resolution, while valuable for radionuclide identification, might overlook the need for sufficient sensitivity efficiency or a rapid response time. If the detector is not efficient enough to detect low-level radiation or is too slow to respond to significant changes, it compromises the ability to provide timely warnings and implement protective actions, again failing to meet regulatory safety standards. An approach that ignores energy dependence would be problematic if the facility handles a variety of radionuclides with different energy emissions. A detector with significant energy dependence might provide inaccurate readings depending on the radiation source, leading to flawed dose assessments and potentially inadequate protective measures. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence in selecting appropriate monitoring equipment. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the monitoring objectives. What types of radiation are expected? What are the expected energy ranges? What are the typical dose rates? And what is the required speed of response? Next, they should research available detector technologies and their specifications, critically evaluating how each characteristic, efficiency, resolution, response time, energy dependence, impacts the ability to meet the monitoring objectives. This involves understanding the trade-offs and selecting the detector that offers the best overall performance profile for the specific application, ensuring compliance with all relevant regulations and ethical obligations to protect health and safety. Question 16. The control framework reveals that following a significant radiation incident, an individual presents with nausea, vomiting, and fatigue within hours of the event. The RSO must determine the most appropriate initial course of action to assess the potential for acute radiation syndrome (ARS). Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory requirements for managing potential radiation exposures and understanding ARS? Option A. Assume the individual is experiencing a mild form of ARS and provide general rest and hydration, deferring any further medical investigation until more severe symptoms manifest. Option B. Conclude that the individual has likely sustained a severe, potentially fatal radiation injury and immediately recommend aggressive, broad-spectrum medical interventions without further diagnostic evaluation. Option C. Focus solely on treating the immediate symptoms of nausea and vomiting, without considering the possibility of radiation exposure or initiating dose assessment, as these symptoms can have numerous non-radiation-related causes. Option D. Immediately initiate supportive care for gastrointestinal distress and monitor for the development of further symptoms, while simultaneously beginning preliminary dose estimation based on incident parameters and the observed prodromal symptoms. The correct answer is D. Immediately initiate supportive care for gastrointestinal distress and monitor for the development of further symptoms, while simultaneously beginning preliminary dose estimation based on incident parameters and the observed prodromal symptoms. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the RSO to differentiate between the early, potentially subtle, and overlapping symptoms of different stages of acute radiation syndrome (ARS) and other medical conditions. Misidentification can lead to delayed or inappropriate treatment, significantly impacting patient outcomes and potentially violating regulatory requirements for prompt and effective radiation protection measures. The RSO must rely on a thorough understanding of radiation biology and clinical presentation, as well as established protocols. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic assessment that prioritizes the identification of ARS based on the known dose-response relationship and characteristic symptom progression. This aligns with regulatory expectations for RSOs to be knowledgeable in radiation effects and to implement appropriate emergency response procedures. Specifically, recognizing the prodromal stages, gastrointestinal and neurological symptoms, followed by a latent period, and then the hematopoietic, gastrointestinal, or cerebrovascular syndromes depending on the dose, is crucial for guiding medical management and informing dose estimation. This approach ensures that the response is tailored to the specific hazard, adhering to the principle of ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable in terms of minimizing harm from radiation exposure. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the symptoms as unrelated to radiation exposure without a comprehensive assessment, especially if the individual was recently involved in a known or suspected radiation incident. This failure to consider radiation as a potential cause is a significant regulatory and ethical lapse, as it neglects the RSO's primary responsibility to protect individuals from radiation hazards. It could lead to a failure to initiate necessary medical interventions and dose assessment, violating regulations that mandate prompt investigation of potential overexposures. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately assume the most severe form of ARS, e.g., cerebrovascular syndrome, based on initial, nonspecific symptoms. This premature and unsubstantiated conclusion can lead to unnecessary panic, misallocation of medical resources, and potentially harmful treatments. Ethically, it violates the principle of providing accurate and evidence-based information. Regulatorily, it bypasses the established diagnostic pathways for ARS, which require careful observation and dose estimation to determine the appropriate syndrome and treatment. A third incorrect approach would be to focus solely on symptomatic treatment without attempting to correlate the symptoms with a potential radiation dose and the stages of ARS. While symptom management is important, it is insufficient without understanding the underlying cause and potential progression. This approach fails to meet regulatory requirements for dose assessment and follow-up after a potential overexposure, which are critical for long-term health monitoring and for preventing future incidents. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a thorough review of the circumstances surrounding the potential exposure. This includes understanding the type of radiation, the duration and proximity of exposure, and any protective measures taken. Following this, a detailed clinical assessment of the individual's symptoms is paramount, comparing them against the known progression of ARS stages. This systematic approach, guided by regulatory requirements and best practices in radiation safety, allows for accurate diagnosis, appropriate medical intervention, and effective dose management. The RSO must maintain open communication with medical professionals and regulatory bodies throughout the process. Question 17. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a critical department is experiencing significant workflow disruptions due to a temporary equipment malfunction, and they are requesting an immediate, albeit temporary, modification to an established radiation safety procedure to expedite a process. As the Radiation Safety Officer, RSO, which of the following actions best upholds regulatory compliance and professional responsibility? Option A. Dismiss the request outright, stating that all established safety procedures must be followed without exception, regardless of operational impact. Option B. Require a formal review and documented approval of the proposed temporary modification, including a risk assessment and specific safety controls, before it is implemented. Option C. Immediately approve the requested modification verbally to minimize operational downtime, with a promise to document it later. Option D. Approve the modification without a formal review, assuming the department's assessment of the situation is accurate and the risk is minimal. The correct answer is B. Require a formal review and documented approval of the proposed temporary modification, including a risk assessment and specific safety controls, before it is implemented. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the RSO to balance the immediate operational needs of a department with the long-term safety and regulatory compliance obligations. The pressure to maintain workflow can create a conflict of interest, where expediency might be prioritized over thorough safety protocols. The RSO must exercise sound judgment to ensure that any deviation from standard procedures is rigorously assessed for risk and justified under specific, documented circumstances, rather than becoming a de facto new standard. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it upholds the fundamental principles of radiation safety and regulatory compliance. By requiring a formal review and approval process for any temporary modification to establish safety procedures, the RSO ensures that risks are systematically identified, evaluated, and mitigated. This aligns with the overarching goal of radiation safety regulations, which mandate that all practices involving radioactive materials be justified, optimized for dose reduction, ALARA, and subject to strict dose limitation. A formal review process ensures that these principles are not compromised, even under pressure for operational continuity. It also provides a documented audit trail, essential for demonstrating compliance during regulatory inspections. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately approving the requested modification without a formal review. This represents a significant regulatory failure because it bypasses established safety protocols designed to protect individuals and the environment from radiation exposure. Ethically, it prioritizes operational convenience over the well-being of personnel and the public, which is a dereliction of the RSO's duty. This action could lead to unassessed risks, potential overexposures, and non-compliance with dose limits. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the request outright without considering any potential for temporary, controlled adjustments. While safety is paramount, rigid inflexibility can sometimes hinder necessary operations. This approach fails to demonstrate professional judgment and problem-solving skills, potentially alienating stakeholders and creating an adversarial relationship. It also misses opportunities to refine existing procedures based on practical operational feedback, provided such refinements are rigorously assessed for safety. A third incorrect approach is to approve the modification verbally and rely on informal communication to inform relevant personnel. This is a critical regulatory and ethical failure. Verbal approvals lack a documented record, making it impossible to verify the authorization or the specific conditions under which it was granted. This significantly undermines accountability and the ability to demonstrate compliance. It also increases the risk of miscommunication and ensures that the modification is not subject to the same level of scrutiny as a formally documented change. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves 1. Understanding the specific request and its potential impact on radiation safety. 2. Consulting relevant regulations and internal safety procedures. 3. Assessing the risks associated with the proposed modification, considering factors like radiation type, energy, quantity, duration of exposure, and personnel involved. 4. Exploring alternative solutions that minimize or eliminate the need for procedural deviation. 5. If deviation is deemed necessary, developing a temporary, controlled procedure with clear safety parameters and approval from appropriate authorities. 6. Documenting the entire process, including the rationale for the decision, the approved temporary procedure, and the duration of its validity. 7. Ensuring all affected personnel are thoroughly briefed on the temporary procedure and its safety implications. Question 18. Regulatory review indicates that a facility's personnel monitoring program, utilizing OSL dosimeters, has identified several workers with dose readings slightly above their historical averages, but still well within regulatory dose limits. As the radiation safety officer, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure both compliance and worker confidence? Option A. Immediately assume that the OSL dosimeters are malfunctioning and order a replacement of all issued dosimeters for the next monitoring period. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the OSL dosimeter reading process, including verification of dosimeter batch integrity, calibration status, and the procedures for processing and interpreting the readings, while also cross-referencing with work activity logs for the affected individuals. Option C. Inform the affected workers that their doses are within limits and therefore no further action is required, as the readings are not a regulatory concern. Option D. Conduct individual interviews with each worker to assess their personal compliance with radiation safety procedures during the monitoring period, focusing on potential deviations. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the OSL dosimeter reading process, including verification of dosimeter batch integrity, calibration status, and the procedures for processing and interpreting the readings, while also cross-referencing with work activity logs for the affected individuals. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for radiation safety officers, RSO, involving the interpretation and application of personnel monitoring data in a practical, real-world setting. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for accurate dose assessment with the operational realities of a facility, particularly when unexpected or potentially anomalous readings arise. The RSO must exercise sound professional judgment, relying on established protocols and regulatory requirements to ensure worker safety and compliance without causing undue alarm or disruption. The challenge is amplified by the potential for misinterpretation of data, equipment malfunction, or procedural errors, all of which could lead to incorrect conclusions about radiation exposure. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, evidence-based investigation that prioritizes regulatory compliance and worker safety. This begins with a thorough review of the monitoring protocols in place, ensuring they align with regulatory requirements for the specific types of radiation sources and work being performed. The RSO must then meticulously examine the dose records for the affected individuals, looking for patterns, trends, and any deviations from expected exposure levels. Crucially, the investigation must include a direct assessment of the monitoring devices themselves, verifying their calibration status, proper usage by personnel, and the integrity of the reading process. If anomalies persist, a detailed review of the work activities during the monitoring period is essential to identify potential sources of exposure or procedural breaches. This comprehensive, multifaceted approach ensures that any elevated readings are accurately understood, the root cause is identified, and appropriate corrective actions are implemented, thereby upholding the highest standards of radiation safety and regulatory adherence. Incorrect approaches analysis. Dismissing the elevated readings without a thorough investigation is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a disregard for the fundamental principle of ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, and the regulatory mandate to track and manage occupational radiation doses. This approach risks underestimating actual exposures, potentially leading to overexposures that could have long-term health consequences for workers and result in severe regulatory penalties. Assuming equipment malfunctions solely based on an elevated reading without a systematic diagnostic process is also professionally unacceptable. While equipment issues can occur, a premature assumption can lead to a failure to identify genuine exposures or procedural problems. This bypasses the necessary steps of verifying device performance and investigating operational factors, which is a direct violation of established monitoring protocols and regulatory expectations for data validation. Focusing exclusively on the individual worker's adherence to procedures without investigating potential systemic issues or environmental factors is an incomplete and potentially unfair assessment. While individual compliance is important, radiation safety is a shared responsibility. This approach fails to consider whether the monitoring protocols themselves are adequate, if the work environment presents unforeseen hazards, or if there are opportunities for improved shielding or work practices that could reduce exposure, all of which are within the RSO's purview and regulatory responsibility. Professional reasoning. When faced with anomalous personnel monitoring data, a radiation safety officer should adopt a structured decision-making process. This process begins with a clear understanding of the applicable regulations and the facility's established monitoring program. The RSO must then initiate a systematic investigation, starting with a review of the data and the monitoring devices. This should be followed by an examination of the work activities and environmental conditions during the period in question. If the initial investigation reveals potential issues, the RSO must consult with relevant personnel, including the affected workers and supervisors, to gather further information. The ultimate goal is to accurately determine the cause of the anomaly, ensure worker safety, and implement any necessary corrective actions or program improvements to maintain regulatory compliance and a robust radiation safety culture. Question 19. The assessment process reveals that routine maintenance is required on a fluoroscopy unit, and personnel will be working in the vicinity of the radiation source. Which of the following strategies best adheres to the fundamental principles of radiation protection for minimizing personnel exposure during this task? Option A. Utilize lead aprons and thyroid shields for all personnel involved. Option B. Perform the maintenance as quickly as possible, regardless of proximity to the source. Option C. Proceed with maintenance without implementing specific dose reduction measures, assuming the unit is functioning correctly. Option D. Increase the distance between personnel and the fluoroscopy unit as much as practically possible. The correct answer is D. Increase the distance between personnel and the fluoroscopy unit as much as practically possible. Explanation. Scenario analysis. The scenario presents a common challenge for radiation safety officers, RSO, where operational efficiency must be balanced with radiation safety principles. Need to perform maintenance on a fluoroscopy unit while minimizing radiation exposure to personnel requires a thorough understanding and application of the fundamental principles of time, distance, and shielding. The challenge lies in ensuring that the chosen method effectively reduces dose without unduly hindering the maintenance process or introducing new safety risks. Professional judgment is crucial in selecting the most appropriate and compliant strategy. Correct approach analysis. Maximizing distance from the radiation source during maintenance is the most effective and often the primary method for dose reduction, as radiation intensity decreases with the square of the distance. This aligns directly with regulatory requirements that mandate minimizing radiation exposure to all individuals. By increasing the distance, the time spent in the radiation field can also be reduced, further compounding the dose reduction. This approach is ethically sound as it prioritizes the well-being of the personnel involved. Incorrect approaches analysis. Relying solely on shielding materials without considering time and distance is insufficient. While shielding is a critical component of radiation protection, its effectiveness is dependent on the type and thickness of the material, as well as the energy of the radiation. Without optimizing time and distance, the shielding might not provide adequate protection, or it might be impractical to implement effectively for all aspects of the maintenance. This could lead to exceeding dose limits. Minimizing exposure time without also considering distance or appropriate shielding is also a flawed approach. While reducing the duration of exposure is beneficial, if personnel remain in close proximity to the source, the cumulative dose can still be significant, especially during prolonged maintenance tasks. This approach neglects the inverse square law and the potential for high dose rates at close distances. Failing to implement any of these principles and proceeding with maintenance without specific dose reduction strategies is a direct violation of regulatory requirements and ethical obligations. It demonstrates a disregard for radiation safety, potentially leading to overexposure of personnel, and a failure to uphold the RSO's responsibility to protect individuals from unnecessary radiation. Professional reasoning. When faced with such a scenario, an RSO should first assess the specific radiation-producing equipment and the nature of the maintenance task. The primary consideration should always be to reduce dose by maximizing distance. If sufficient distance cannot be achieved, then appropriate shielding should be implemented. The duration of the task should be minimized as much as practically possible, and if necessary, personnel should be rotated to limit individual exposure times. A comprehensive risk assessment, incorporating these principles, should guide the decision-making process, ensuring compliance with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. Question 20. Governance review demonstrates that a radiation worker's cumulative occupational dose for the year is approaching the regulatory annual limit. The worker is currently engaged in a task that involves potential exposure to radiation. What is the most appropriate immediate action for the radiation safety officer to take? Option A. Immediately assess the worker's current dose, project their potential cumulative dose based on the remaining work, and implement controls to prevent exceeding the regulatory limit. Option B. Continue the work as planned, assuming the worker will not exceed the limit by the end of the year. Option C. Immediately suspend all work involving radiation until a full investigation can be completed. Option D. Only consider the worker's current recorded dose and disregard any projected dose for the remainder of the task. The correct answer is A. Immediately assess the worker's current dose, project their potential cumulative dose based on the remaining work, and implement controls to prevent exceeding the regulatory limit. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the RSO to interpret and apply dose limits in a situation where a worker's exposure is approaching a regulatory threshold, and there's a potential for exceeding it due to ongoing work. The challenge lies in balancing the need for continued operations with the paramount importance of worker safety and regulatory compliance. A hasty decision could lead to overexposure, while an overly cautious one might unnecessarily halt critical activities. The RSO must exercise sound judgment, informed by a thorough understanding of the regulations and the specific operational context. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves immediately assessing the worker's current dose, projecting their potential cumulative dose based on the remaining work and the established dose limits, and then implementing controls to prevent exceeding these limits. This aligns with the fundamental principle of ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, and the specific occupational dose limits mandated by regulation. By taking proactive steps such as modifying work procedures, increasing shielding, or limiting work duration, the RSO ensures compliance with the regulatory framework, protects the worker from potential stochastic and deterministic health effects, and upholds their ethical responsibility as a safety professional. This approach demonstrates a commitment to regulatory adherence and a proactive safety culture. Incorrect approaches analysis. Continuing the work without any intervention, assuming the worker will not exceed the limit, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It disregards the potential for unforeseen circumstances or inaccuracies in dose estimation, leading to a direct violation of occupational dose limits and jeopardizing the worker's health. This approach is negligent and demonstrates a lack of due diligence, focusing solely on the worker's current recorded dose without considering the projected dose for the remainder of the task is also a regulatory failure. Occupational dose limits are cumulative over specific periods, e.g., a year. Ignoring the projected dose means failing to manage exposure proactively and potentially allowing the worker to exceed the limit by the end of the period. This is a failure to implement effective dose management strategies. Implementing a blanket suspension of all work involving radiation without a specific assessment of the risk, and the worker's projected dose is an inefficient and potentially unnecessary response. While caution is important, this approach may not be proportionate to the actual risk and could disrupt operations without a clear regulatory basis for such an extreme measure, failing to demonstrate a balanced and informed decision-making process. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with this situation should first consult the relevant regulatory documents to confirm the exact occupational dose limits for the applicable period. They should then gather all available information on the worker's current dose, the nature of the work being performed, and the estimated duration and intensity of radiation exposure. Based on this data, a projected dose should be calculated. If the projected dose approaches or exceeds the regulatory limit, the RSO must immediately implement dose reduction strategies. This might involve modifying the work scope, increasing distance from the source, using additional shielding, or reducing the time spent in the radiation field. Continuous monitoring and re-evaluation of the situation are crucial. If there is any doubt, erring on the side of caution and implementing protective measures is always the most responsible course of action.